All right, welcome everybody. Over to you, Mike Bauer.
Okay, thank you, Rose. Zowe releases and technology expectations. So first, let's start with Zowe releases. So if you recall, the first major release of Zowe was back in February of 2019. A year after that, in February of 2020, we released Zowe V1 LTS, the long-term support distribution. And what we are preparing for is another long-term support distribution in Zowe V2. Each long-term support release has a lifespan of 4.5 years. They spend 2 years in active phase. In active phase, they receive updates regularly according to the schedule. You may be familiar with, we've been delivering on Zowe V1 LTS for some time now. Started with 1.9 and has incrementally received updates along the way. That will transition then into maintenance phase for 2 years. During maintenance phase, releases will be more on demand rather than at a regular cadence, and they will be focused on only providing fixes and security patches. This opens up the doors for consumers to consume new major releases of Zowe in a variety of ways. They can update from active phase to active phase to active phase as they move from V1 LTS to V2 LTS to V3 LTS. They can do the same if they want to stay in maintenance phase. Those are probably the two most recommended strategies. Another one is you could stay on a release for its entire lifespan, active through maintenance, and then skip the next release and jump onto the active phase of the following release. And you can see that in the release timeline chart below. Moving to technology expectations, each extension applies for conformance for a particular LTS release or a particular major distribution. So you may be familiar, and a lot of extenders on the call today have applied for Zowe V1 LTS conformance, whether that's for an API mediation layer, integrated API, an application that extends the app framework, a CLI plugin, or a VS Code extension that extends the Zowe Explorer. We expect that all those current V1 LTS conformant extensions will reapply for conformance for V2. This ensures to the wider community that your extensions will continue to work with the latest major release of Zowe. And it also ensures that really the conformance criteria over time becomes more strict, so that even an even greater experience can be consumed by our end users. With that, I'm going to jump in to Zowe CLI new features, breaking changes, as well as V2 conformance. So first, some exciting new features are coming for the Zowe CLI, and these benefits are generally extended to each one of Zowe CLI's plugins. First, we heard from consumers that it's fairly difficult and an arduous task to get started with Zowe CLI, having to create profiles for each service. And as you can imagine, if you have many different services, many different plugins, this becomes a very, very time-consuming task. Some consumers have automated this in various ways, but we've abstracted away the need for everyone to create profiles within an organization. Instead, a team lead or an admin at the organization can create a team configuration file and then just share that with others in the organization. They may share that through a shared URL, a shared network drive, or even just sending it over an email or chat, and that'll enable folks to get started more easily than having to run more complex commands. In addition, for those who leverage the Zowe API Mediation Layer, we've automated the creation of the team configuration file. So if your organization has adopted Zowe API Mediation Layer, with a single command, you can be configured to connect to all those services that have CLI plugins. We also heard from consumers that the performance of CLI was a little less than desirable in certain environments. These environments were places where node processes took a while to start up. And in the core CLI, today, every command is independent. A node process needs to be spawned for each command. Daemon mode eliminates that issue by just spawning one long running process and being able to use that for additional requests. So it greatly improves the performance of the CLI in certain environments, and it improves the performance in some capacity in all environments. And finally, we have secure by default. We provide a secure out of the box experience in the V2 LTS version by including the secure credential feature as part of the core Zowe CLI package. Today, it's offered as a separate plugin that you need to install and set up. And a lot more details on each one of these new features is available in the form of a blog on our Medium site. That's medium.com/Zowe, and you see them listed here on the right. Now we can move on to some breaking changes that are occurring as we move from V1 LTS to V2 LTS from an extender point of view. So if you've developed a plugin into Zowe CLI today, it's likely that you have the @Zowe/CLI package listed as a peer dependency. That will no longer be needed. And in fact, we recommend not having that anymore. This is primarily for better compatibility with more recent releases of NPM, the NPM CLI that's used to install these plugins behind the scenes. The second breaking change is some plugins had implemented gzip decompression. That is now part of the abstract REST client of Imperative. So if you had implemented your own form of gzip decompression, we recommend migrating to the one that's built into Imperative. The following breaking change is any command that has an option of DCD or an alias of DCD may not behave the way you expect it to. This is a global option now for daemon mode current directory. And finally, the plugin management facility require plugin module callback. The return value of that has changed. I'm not going to go into too much detail here, but if you simply look at the before and after state of these calls below, you can see that the primary reason for this change was just to simplify that syntax. If we move to the next set of breaking changes, each one of these changes were deprecated in V1 LTS, and these are the recommended migration paths. A lot of them are to standardize on naming and be more consistent between different functions or different how constants are defined. For example, it's unlikely a lot of these will have any impact to plugins. For example, the ones listed workflows, that would only impact you if you were calling into the workflows functionality. And I don't believe anyone is doing that, but any possible breaking change is all listed here, as well as the migration path of if you were using what's listed on the left, you should transition to what's listed on the right. If something you were using happens to be removed and that's causing a significant issue, please feel to reach out and we can give you a migration path. Moving on to V2 conformance. This is where—
Can you ask questions?
Yeah, sure.
One thing, the slides were cut off at the bottom. Not sure I have to change my Zoom level here in Zoom itself. But the credentials manager and the ability to manage secure credentials in an alternative place, isn't that also a breaking change? Or have you implemented this interface that you can still provide your own credentials manager?
So we're not aware of any use of that secure credential manager extension point beyond that of the secure credential store plugin. I don't believe that code's been completely removed as of yet, but if you have a need to extend it for your own secure credential management solution, perhaps we could talk in more detail on that outside of this call.
Yep, I remember we discussed it right in Slack about the need to do this on Kubernetes with Eclipse. And so implementing something that use perhaps in Kubernetes protocols instead of Kita.
So the current thought process in regards to functionality like that would be to, just like we're contributing the secure credential store functionality into core, we would contribute such an extension point like secure credential store in J or Kubernetes or what have you, could contribute that into core and make it an integrated experience. But if there is a reason to separate out something like that into a separate plugin, we can discuss that more in another call.
Thanks.
Yep, it's a good question. For V2 conformance, just going to briefly go through this. I think this is where more of the requests come for extenders to make updates. So I already covered gzip decompression and that the @Zowe/CLI peer dependency should be removed. For installation requirements, it was a requirement of V1 LTS that the plugin is installable into @Zowe V1 LTS. That trend will continue. In that V2, you should have a Zowe V2 LTS tag version of your plugin on public NPM. This allows all consumers to install the core and all CLI plugins at the same tag. So whether they want the Zowe V1 LTS line or the Zowe V2 LTS line. A new addition to the conformance criteria is that latest on public NPM. This also means if you don't specify a tag, they should get the most recent LTS tag. A lot of folks had been using this in this manner, but some were using latest as a validation line of code or something like that, and it was incompatible with the most recent LTS line. So we recommend now that latest also points to Zowe V2 LTS, and of course, when we release a Zowe V3 LTS, latest will move with it. If you still need to validate different distributions before putting them in an LTS release, we recommend the next tag. We don't have a conformance criteria requiring that because we don't require folks to have validation versions. But if you do, that's what we recommend. That's what we use across Zowe as our validation tag. There's some naming requirements. These were true, but not necessarily mentioned in conformance for V1. DCD, that's a new option that's reserved. But these other options are just listed also for awareness that they're reserved as global options that should not be repurposed on individual commands. So that's response format JSON, its alias RFJ, help, its alias H, help examples, help web, and its alias HW. Moving on to the next slide for required conformance is new profile requirements. A lot of this is around naming. So if you're using if your plugin uses a Zowe API ML integrated API, it should have an option named base path, which is what determines where the mediation layer will route those calls. And it needs to be named exactly base path. We use this when we're running an auto init command to automatically set up configuration. And also I'll note that in some plugins, it used some sort of Boolean value for whether or not you are going through the mediation layer. It needs to be base path. It needs to be a string because those paths are actually customizable at client sites. 2 is if you connect to a service, most extenders do connect to a service. You need to have the values or the properties host, port, user, and password, and they need to be those exact names, host, not host name. This is for consistency across plugins, but it's also because with the new team config, you can share properties across plugins, across different profiles, as long as they're the same name. And we don't want to have folks specifying both host and host name. It'd be a redundant and less than desirable user experience. That same sort of mindset strategy, it applies to these next conformance criteria as well. If you're supporting logging in with a token type and token value should be used. If you're supporting logging in with PEM certificates, cert file and cert key file should be used. support logging in with PFX certificates, cert file and cert file passphrase should be used. If you allow folks to specify an option to reject untrusted certificates or self-signed certificates, that property should be reject unauthorized. I just mentioned here the CLI options, reject dash unauthorized. CLI options are recommended to be kebab case, but then properties in the config, they're all camel case. Plugin supports team profile config. If you meet all the other conformance criteria, this should just naturally happen. Would recommend trying to test that out though, but that you should just get that if you abide by the other conformance criteria. Supports base profiles. Base profiles have been out a long time. They're an enabler for API mediation layer. If you're accessing services through API mediation layer to be able to use tokens for access. They're also nice because they're a fallback from specific profile properties, so that if you want to if you were accessing everything on one host, for example, or you wanted to set reject unauthorized in one place, you could do that in a base profile. And lastly, to take advantage of the Zowe config auto init command, if your plugin does work with single sign-on and it's an API ML conformant REST service, you need to add an object that tells us the API ID and gateway URL of the corresponding REST service. A similar update is made on the server side in the application YAML definition. And then this is what's handling how we know to automatically set up the configuration on the client. We have a plugin that's looking for an API ID. That API ID is recognized on the server. It feeds us back the appropriate base path, and we put that in the configuration. Is how that's working behind the scenes. And then briefly on the next slide, we'll go through some best practices for V2 conformance. One is just to keep your imports few and as specific as possible to improve performance. HTTP or HTTPS requests to REST API should use our imperative REST client. Names of CLI command groups options must be kebab cases is highly recommended. I didn't want to make this necessarily required as it may result in breaking changes for some plugins, like in a significant amount of those. So going forward, though, recommend consistency on this case. For new profile best practices, there's an option not necessarily on auto init. I think it's there as well. Auto init handles connection information, but even on just regular init, when you create your initial Zowe config JSON file, you can pre-fill properties that you think are likely for your end users to need to edit within your profile. So if you have anything where it's a common use case that they need to have this property, we recommend going ahead and putting that property in there with a placeholder value, just because it's a little easier to just edit a value than add a property. But I will note you do have IntelliSense when editing these Zowe config JSONs in a Visual Studio Code environment. So it does make that experience a little bit easier. And lastly, documentation best practices. Today we host web help and frequently point folks to web help on Zowe doc site. We're extending that to allow ecosystem CLI plugins, conformant CLI plugins to contribute their web help, and we will rehost that on Zowe doc site as well. And you just follow the instructions in this Zowe repository to complete that, and that's Zowe CLI web help generator repository. And with that, that concludes the updates for Zowe CLI. I'll turn it over now to Jelly to cover Zowe Explorer.
All right, so for Zowe Explorer, the new features that we're planning, or at least we want to deliver for V2 is what, like Mike said, the team configuration file. So for Zowe Explorer, we're going to support the team configuration file that the Zowe CLI is developing, and you would expect, or at least you have an expectation that if you create your configuration file, team configuration file via CLI, it will work in Zowe Explorer and vice versa. Another feature that we wanted to deliver is the multi-select support. And this gives you the ability to have, let's say, multiple actions in one dataset or one USS and one jobs pool. And we're also delivering the improved extensible APIs where there will be improvements in our settings view, in the TAI IDE with standardized setting names format. And we've added this list of new APIs. So we have a new API called register custom profiles. So if you have a custom profile similar to the Kix extension, you can use this API to register it through Zowe Explorer. We have a new error logging API, or have an API as well for initially init for Zowe, and the profiles cache, where this API will allow you to access our cache for profiles, and this also supports the team configuration file. And if you're still using the old style profiles, you can also get it here in this profile cache API. And also Kitar API, where you can get the secure credentials support or secure credential as an API through Zowe Explorer. Next slide, please. So for breaking changes, with our V2 release, we did have some improvements in our naming convention and our formatting. So to provide consistency, so please take note that we are changing our Zowe Explorer view IDs, and it might affect some of the extensions available today. We're also migrating our old settings to new standardized settings in Zowe Explorer. So if you're also using our old format of settings, you will be affected by this V2 release. We're also removing the associated profiles. And if you want more information about this, I added a link for our documentation. So you could check it out and read more and get more information. Next slide, please. So for V2 conformance, we're the following list or the following items are best practices for us for V1, but we will tag it as required. But please note that this is still in progress. And if you want to discuss it with us, please join us in Slack or in our GitHub discussion, and we can still talk about this. So just to take note, the criteria that we are planning to set as required is that, one, it's still under discussion that it will be required that no Zowe CLI plugin installation will be required. It is also required that you are going to be consistent with our user settings rules and also our error message consistency. We also are discussing about setting the Zowe SDK usage as a requirement. For data provider extensions, we are requiring the support for team configuration file for our extension, and still under discussion is the secure credential store if you are using old style profiles. For extension adding menus, we are requiring the criteria for menu names and the context menu items, which is the breaking change that I've discussed before. And if you want to check this out, please click on the link that I've stated as well here in this slide. And I'm giving this over to Elliot.
Yeah, thanks, Joey. So in terms of new features for V2 for the API mediation layer, a couple of catalog related things to tell you about. So the first thing regards the UI framework. So we're currently using Mineral, which is no longer actively developed. So we've decided to make the change to Material. So you'll notice, we've started that work already, and you'll notice, when you pick up V2 that there'll be a change in the look and feel in terms of the user experience and the UI. And then secondly, something else that we've been working on this year is we added a new endpoint to the mediation layer that helps that enables Zowe clients to process a password change. So without that in place, if you were using any particular Zowe client, and you needed to change your password, you would have to do that directly on the mainframe. But now with this endpoint, we're giving the option for Zowe clients to actually build that into their UI, so that the user doesn't have to switch context. Okay, so those are the two catalog related changes. Next, we're going to talk about breaking changes. Jakub, do you want to talk to this slide?
Sure. So basically, the first change, which is around the move of the service ID, is probably the only one that most of you will need to know about. We've been already talking about this for a year now, and with the V2, we are removing the support for the service ID as the third part of the URL. You can see here the example of the old and new. As is noted here, the action for the extenders. I wouldn't even say that you yourselves need to reflect this new pattern, but anybody who uses your service needs to reflect this. You can verify already as the Zowe V1 supports both of the patterns, so you can already start with the new one. The move to the core service to the different publishing location is mainly for people who are developing extensions to the gateway or other core services for the API ML itself. And to clearly distinguish that there are some parts that are part of the SDK, such as Zowe client or enablers, we move the core services into a different location. So if you are using org/zowe/apiml/sdk/gateway package, you will need to update your pipelines probably mostly, and maybe dependencies to properly reflect this change. Apart from this, there is one very small change. This is the remove support for the differing authentication schemas per the service instance. We hope nobody ever uses this actually, but it was implemented, and as such, removing it is a breaking change. And in theory, this allowed you to integrate multiple instances of the service in the SSO and asking for different things. So e.g. one instance of the service would get pass ticket and the other one would get the JWT. And the last one, this around how we work with the environment variables. If you at some point needed to update and change properties within the API mediation layer, you usually went into the instance env and changed some of random parameters there. Instead, we are adapting to the new manifest.yml, where I believe Jack will talk about it a bit more. And so there will be a different structure of how you adapt and change the parameters for the API mediation layer. And I would say that's it, Elliot.
Yeah, thanks, Jakub. So couple of changes to the conformance criteria to tell you about. So this first one that you're seeing here was actually the first point that Jakub mentioned in terms of a breaking change. So this is where the service ID should now be in first place in the path. So again, version 1 of Zowe, that's we support both first and last position. But then, moving to version 2, it really does need to be just in the first position. So that should be a relatively a small change. So moving to the next slide, and the second one. This was referenced by Mike earlier on as part of the CLI automated team configuration feature. So in order for that to work for folks that have the mediation layer, you do need to make sure that the API ID field is present. So consider that as a kind of a unique identifier for the service. So just make sure that field is there, and then you'll be able to take advantage of that great new feature on the CLI.
Okay. Then I guess I can start talking about some app framework features. Just a summary of the overall changes in version 2. We've kind of been going with the goal of install and configuration simplification, although that did cause some breaking changes. There's also been some increased overhead reduced overhead and increased performance due to what we've done with the servers, and improved networking, and finally ZSS now has a 64-bit version. So starting with the web explorer, what we've done is there used to be a total of 5 servers
that comprised the web explorers. There were the 3 Node.js servers that hosted the UI, and then there were 2 Java servers that hosted the REST API. So the Node servers will no longer exist in version 2 because the web code will now be hosted by the app server, which is the same server that hosts the desktop. So we've kind of consolidated from 3+1 servers down to just 1, adding this new dependency on that the app server must be running for the explorers to run. The jobs and dataset APIs are now no longer needed by the explorers, so you can run without them and they will be disabled by default, but you can turn them on if you need them for some extension. Overall, this should reduce the process count, memory usage, and speed up ZDT. The second item is just the simplification on how we do a security check. We had referrer checks that would sometimes get confused about what host name you were operating from and would require configuration. So we just got rid of that and switched to a cookie option that serves the same purpose. So no longer will you need configuration. This will be automatic and just easier. Second thing that we've done that could reduce configuration needs is to remove loopback routing in the app server. Basically, sometimes the app server would need to contact itself in V1, and we've eliminated the need for that. So this should reduce times in which you ever needed to specify a loopback IP and could improve performance slightly. Then we also have one big change here that in V1, when you were operating with the app server and CSS, you would sometimes have to work with this file called server.json, which was an extra configuration file versus the centralized instance.env that we used. Well, in Zowe version 2, both of those files are going away, instance.env and server.json. In their place, there will be a file called zowe.yaml. And since the zowe.yaml has the same sort of structural abilities as JSON files, everything that you used to specify in server.json can now be specified in zowe.yaml instead, same structure. And as for instance.env variables, those can be specified in zowe.yaml as well. So moving on to the next set of features, we have some new port numbers for the app framework servers. This is just to make it easier to assign ports, because in version 1 there was a split in port ranges where some servers were on 7.5 and some were on 8.5. So now it's going to be the case that the app server and ZSS and the job and dataset servers will come after the mediation layer ports. So they'll all be right next to each other. Another default config improvement is that the app server used to by default bind to 0000 IP address, which was not necessarily the value that you requested in your Zowe config. So in V2, we will now just be using the same IP address that the rest of the servers use for consistency. Speaking of consistency, some variable names, maybe not default ones, but ones that you might use for advanced configuration, had some sort of outdated names. And so in V2, we wanted to take the opportunity to align things to using prefixes related to what part of Zowe they were. So ZWED is the desktop/app server, and ZWES is ZSS. Another enhancement is that the desktop desktop login page, if you ever fail to log in, you used to get a very vague message that login failed without really telling you why. So in V2, you're going to get much better messages now that will give you some information about, oh, you know, maybe there's a networking issue or something like that, so that you could troubleshoot it. The next item, ZSS 64-bit, I mentioned just a moment ago. Basically, we've improved the code base, so now ZSS can be compiled for both 31-bit and 64-bit. This improves performance, but it also improves the way in which it interacts with VIF. And finally, on the desktop side of things, since the desktop sort of deduplicates and centralizes some libraries running in the browser, we needed to upgrade those so that applications can leverage newer versions of common libraries. So Angular, Core.js, TypeScript, they all get upgraded. There might be some more minor ones, but those are really the ones that you would need to know about. So if we move on to breaking changes, some of those features have complications. The first is that when we consolidate the Web Explorer servers to be running off of the app server, now the URLs have changed. The features have not changed, but if you've bookmarked old URLs, you'll need to change them. If you have an extension that assumes URLs, they'll need to be updated. The general shape of the URLs remains the same, but the prefix of the URLs that say that you're pointing at, for example, the Zowe Explorer, will now need to change to point to the app server instead, which has a bit of a different prefix. So the second item here, when I talked about reducing loopback use on the app server, some ways in which this was done are being done by making a function call that looks like a network request, but actually isn't. And so we've tried to mimic this as good as we can, but it's hard to guarantee that it's 100% compatible. So for most people, for most extensions, there will be no difference. But if there are complications, we will have a flag in which you can revert to the old behavior. When I mentioned that server.json was being removed, any application that tried to write to it to set some configuration is going to break. But the fix is to instead try to write the same configuration to Zowe.yaml instead, because they are equivalent in what you can do. As for the desktop library versions, we have done some testing on our own applications, and we noticed that some plugins will be fine with the changes as is. However, it's recommended and would be part of our conformance program that you do match the versions of the libraries that come out of the desktop. So previously in V1, applications would use Angular 6. And although applications built for Angular 6 may work in an Angular 12 desktop, it's just much better to upgrade to Angular 12. We will have examples of how we did these things. So Angular 12, Core.js 3, and TypeScript 4 are just library versions to be aware of. Finally, when it comes to ZSS, actually, there was one more thing here. Just when I mentioned ZSS 64, if you want to take advantage of ZSS 64, you will need to recompile your ZSS plugin. But that wouldn't be the case if you continue to use ZSS 31-bit. So not necessarily a breaking change, just something you can take advantage of. The cookie, however, if any extensions are looking for the ZSS cookie, you will need to revise to a slightly different cookie name, because now we are including either a port name or a high availability ID to distinguish between ZSS if you have more than one running in your environment. So I believe that covers everything, unless there's something on the next. Oh yes, conformance. So I mentioned a few things, but primarily we just want to make sure that you're no longer using server.json, that you do upgrade your desktop libraries, and that a few of these other things. The infrastructure for install and config, which will be talked about more, basically requires that you make your extensions compatible with installing things as a component. So in version 1, you could install app framework plugins rather directly by using install app.sh. We don't want you to do that anymore because there is components tooling instead, which will better integrate with our plans for like an app store in the future. So component tooling will make life better, but in order to get there, we need to stop using the install app script. We've removed some parts of the conformance program that were unnecessary, such as the internationalization conformance. Some people thought it was mandatory, but it is optional. We also noticed that when it comes to REST APIs, you document them if they are intended to be used by others. And then also there were some removals about how to install iframe apps that are really now just covered under make sure that you distribute your plugins as components. So nothing too significant on the conformance changes, but just some little things that go along with the breaking changes.
So I want to talk about some changes related to systems and the installation. So we do have a new server command, we call it ZWE, and they introduce it to help the user to simplify their install and configuration experience. In the past, we provide a lot of utility scripts, and most of the scripts are consolidated to the new ZWE command. So this server command, if you are familiar with use Zowe CLI, you will see this is very familiar. So every command and the subcommands, you can use ZWE-H to get help, or --help to get a help message to know what command you can use and what subcommands are supported. And we have a consistent --log directory. If you command you want to save the logs to a target file, logging file, so that's a consistent parameter. Also, we have a verbose mode and a trace mode, so that's consistent to all the ZWE server command. You can have different level of debugging messages. So the second part, we provide shell function libraries instead of individual utility scripts. So the shell function library is including a lot of features. You can use them to execute a TSO command, operator command, submit job, check job status, etc. So just to keep aware of there are some commands and functions, we mark them as experimental or internal. So just be aware of them. So to use in your pipeline or installation script. So some of the changes relate to install, detailed changes. During the install, with version 2, there's no new runtime directory will be created. In version 1, after you run the zowe-install.sh, a new runtime directory will be created. But in version 2, this is not needed. So what are you extracted are gonna be the runtime directory right away. A Zowe.yaml file can be used to centralize all configuration options. So this configuration is compatible with all the Zowe use cases. So like a high availability and containerization. So you can use all the same Zowe.yaml with all the use cases. And for almost all Zowe configuration steps, we now will provide the automation option ZW init command. So ZW init command also includes some subcommands. And if you are not comfortable to run them all at once, you can run step by step like in version 1. But if you are comfortable and you have proper permission on the target system, ZW init can do everything in one tab, submit to the system. So it can do like submit a job, submit, configure ZW secure, create a certificate all at once. You still have the flexibility to run all steps one by one. So that's your choice. And we also provide a security dry run mode. With this mode, so for example, you don't have a permission to configure security to run ZW secure. And the security dry run mode will create those commands at the GCL. So you can pass along them to your sysadmin to help ask them to run them for you, configure them for you. And you can run all steps from USS. In the past, some of the command you must switch to TN270 to run some GCL, but in version 2, you can do everything on the USS. So next one. So for extensions and other components, when they create, we do have new changes to mandated manifest.yaml to interact with Zowe and how other components run in the same server, same instance. So in the manifest, you can use a YAML format or a JSON format, that doesn't matter. The manifest allows you to define how your component extension should register to APML, should register on the Zowe App Framework desktop, can register on the Zowe the ZS plugin, etc. So whether you have Java extension library for APML, so it can be defined in manifest and it will handle automatically by the component install command or the Zowe start command. So that's a component can also define their own configs in the manifest.yaml. So this is mentioned in some of the changes previously on APML and the desktop. The configs help you to define what kind of configuration you want to expose to the end user to customize. Also, it's a central location to tell Zowe start script what are the default values if the end user doesn't define them. So this option is also compatible with the high availability mode. So this is another change related to the dataset usage. So in the past, you may see we use SZWE-auth and SZWE SUMP. So those two are still kept, but we added some new. And also the new utility script we put in SZWE-exec. Also, in the past version 2, we also ask the user to define custom param label, etc. So in version 2, this can be automated with ZW init command. You just need to define them in the Zowe.yaml, where is your custom param label, etc. Okay, so with this new features, we do have a lot of breaking changes related. So if we check the breaking changes, so since Zowe doesn't have the runtime directory, a separate runtime directory, so when you extract the Zowe, unpack Zowe, you should use -ppx to preserve the extended file attributes. If you extension installation uses some scripts like Zowe install cross memory, Zowe install proc, or some validation scripts in the past. So those are all consolidated into the new ZW server command format. So there's most of them will have a matching command or a shell library you can use. ZWE SVSTC is deprecated. So in the version 2, we only provide ZWSL STC to start Zowe call services. ZWSI STC and ZWSA STC still kept as the same. Instance.env is deprecated. And so a new Zowe.yaml is mandated and will take the place for the configuration. Zowe now will also allow fine-grained customization of instance directory that including the logs, workspace, and the configuration file. By default, so in version 2, these are still organized the group under looks like an instance directory, but you can change it to anywhere you are comfortable on the system. Environment variables are changed a lot. So we first want to consolidate most of the Zowe variables to prefix with ZWE underscore. And all the Zowe.yaml configuration entries will be automatically converted to an environment variable. So there's a pattern. So if you use some environment variable in the past, for example, the very notable Zowe Explorer host, that's gonna be replaced with new variable name. Some of the changes related to IP are removed. So even in the Zowe.yaml version 1, Zowe.yaml, and we consolidate them in favor of the host name or domains. Component or extension manifest is mandatory. So if you want your component or extension to work with manifest, work with Zowe version 2, a manifest YAML or JSON is mandatory. And the user must use ZW components install to install your extension. So next, I just want to, so in the past version 1, we don't have a solid rule criteria for installation packaging. And so in version 2, we introduced some new criteria for packaging format. As mentioned in previous slide, so package manifest is mandated, and some of the fields we introduce is recommended, and some of them are required. In version 1, we also introduced containerization, and currently in version 1, the containerization performance is a draft, and it's optional. And in version 2, if your extension support containerization, and these are the criteria should be followed. So it describes how the image should be defined and how the container should be started, etc.
All right, hearing none. Again, I thank you all. We wish you a wonderful holiday season. We'll catch up with all of you on the 5th of January.